Good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Schanzer. I'm Vice President for Research here at Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And I'd like to welcome everyone to the Dr. Bob Shillman Conference Room. I would also like to welcome those of you watching today's event on C-SPAN. Today's panel discussion is titled From Truman to Obama, the Past, Present, and Future of U.S. Israel Relations. I'm particularly pleased to welcome our panelists today. In the spirit of the Olympics, this is the dream team for an event of this kind. It's my pleasure to welcome Ken Stein, who is among the country's foremost scholars of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Ken is the founder of the Center for Israel Education, a remarkable nonprofit designed to help educators teach about Israel. Ken was my professor back in the early 90s at Emory University, where he has taught since 1977 and where he still teaches today. Ken is a friend and a mentor. I learned a great deal from him, and I'm sure that you will too. I'm also pleased to welcome Ambassador Dennis Ross, who has watched the U.S. Israel relationship evolve as a senior U.S. government official across several administrations. I was honored to call him a colleague when I worked at the Washington Institute a little bit more than a decade ago. Dennis recently wrote a terrific book called Doomed to Succeed, which documents the history of the U.S. Israel alliance. Moderating today's discussion is FDD's senior counselor, John Hanna. John, as a veteran senior U.S. government official, has also watched this alliance evolve over several administrations. This is the moment where I ask you all here to turn off your cell phones or to set them to vibrate. We want to make sure that today's event is not interrupted. Yeah, that includes the panelists. Once again, welcome, and thank you all for joining us today. John, over to you.
Great, thank you, Jonathan, and thanks to all of you for coming, and thanks especially to Ken and Dennis for being here. Now, Jonathan referred to his long relationship with Ken. Well, you know, maybe this is like bring your mentor to work day, because Dennis and I actually go back a very long way as well to my time as a graduate student at Stanford in the early 1980s. And though I think Dennis may regret this today, he actually got me my very first job in Washington, which was also at the Washington Institute, it so happens, as well as my first job in government, working for him at the State Department on the policy planning staff. And I actually blame all of that as the reason why I never actually finished my PhD, you'll know. Now, back then, of course, the world was a much simpler place, right, Dennis? When all we had to do was deal with issues like Saddam's invasion of Kuwait and the collapse of the Soviet Union, reunification of Germany. It was all very easy stuff, the good old days. But anyway, through all the years, Dennis has really been a good friend and a source of a lot of advice and wisdom, and it's great to have both him and Ken here today. Now, as Jonathan mentioned, the purpose of the discussion is to try and take stock of the U.S.-Israel relationship, both look back, looking forward, provide some sense of historical context for what is certainly among the most important, and I think people can make an argument that it may be the most important bilateral relationship in American foreign policy. This seemed particularly opportune time to do so, given the fact that we're approaching the end of one administration. And in just a little more than 5 months' time, hard to believe, we'll be watching the inauguration of a new and different president of the United States. And who knows, maybe a very different president of the United States. We'll see, although, you know, the polls are the polls. For many of us who have followed relations between the United States and Israel, the past 7.5 years under President Obama have certainly felt like a very stressful and tumultuous time. It's also been a paradoxical time in many ways. On the one hand, as the president frequently tells us, and not without good cause, security and intelligence cooperation between the two countries has never been stronger. Indeed, it appears that we're on the verge now of successfully completing a new 10-year MOU that will include very significant increases in U.S. military assistance to Israel. And yet, at the same time, the more visible political relationship between our governments has consistently seemed very, very fraught, lurching from crisis of confidence to another crisis of confidence filled with degrees of venom and insults and mistrust that have often really left certainly supporters of Israel kind of aghast and stunned. And more importantly, there have been real and fundamental policy differences as well, and most strikingly, of course, in the clash over the Iranian nuclear deal. an issue that many in Israel saw as existential in terms of their security and survival, but where Israel's interests and concerns at the end of the day appeared to end up taking a back seat. Adding to the growing sense of gloom, I think, have been a lot of public statements, like the one attributed to Ben Rhodes, the president's assistant, in his profile in New York Times Magazine last May, where he explained that the Iran deal was intended to, quote, create the space for America to disentangle itself from its established system of alliances with countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, and Israel. With one bold move, the article went on, the administration would effectively begin the process of a large-scale disentanglement from the Middle East. So in light of all this apparent Sturm und Drang, I wanted to start with both Ken and Dennis by asking you to assess just where you think we are in the relationship today. How should we think about these past 7.5 years? How do they fit in the historical evolution of the relationship that both of you have spent so much time studying and explaining? Has all this tension that we've seen just been another temporary hiccup in an overall upward trajectory of ever deeper cooperation between our countries? Or is something more fundamental at work in the world, in the U.S., in Israel, that suggests that the recent tensions and differences may reflect something more long-lasting, change that's afoot, and maybe even for the worse? So Ken, why don't you kick us off?
In the context of 70 years, I think it's fair to say that this is one of the most difficult times the U.S.-Israeli relationship has lived through. But there have been others as well over the last 70 years. Begin-Carter was pretty bad. We've had times when secretaries of state have been pretty angry and pretty virulent in their anger against prime ministers. One of the reasons that the relationship sustains itself is, of course, the premises upon which it is based, namely the values and the common identity. But also, one of the reasons Israel seems to stay as a primary objective of American friendship is the Middle East as a region continues to change and churn. And back in the 50s, one of the reasons the United States found itself attached to Israel was because of the Cold War. Not because necessarily that the State Department or people in the 40s liked it. And as the region continues to change and Israel continues to remain stable, Israel remains an aircraft carrier or a viable friend, even with all of the stuff that goes on beneath the surface. I mean, how many times can a Secretary of State in the last 30 years say, we oppose settlements, or settlements are an obstacle to peace, or settlements don't do anyone any good? And yet, there is this incredible strategic relationship which sustains itself. So I think the fact that if Israel were not the only reliable friend that the United States had in the Middle East on a regular basis, it might be a little bit more difficult for Israel. But at the present time, given where the Middle East is headed, I think the relationship's pretty strong. And prime ministers and presidents go. They don't stay forever.
Dennis?
Look, obviously, having written a book entitled Doomed to Succeed.
We know the ending.
Yeah, so, I mean, the thrust of the book is that you have ups and downs, there are going to be differences, but there's something fundamental that has drawn us together, and the essence of that is pretty much what Ken was saying. It's not unique to have presidents and prime ministers not get along. Ken talked about Carter and Begin. Well, actually, Reagan and Begin were, in many ways, in the end, even a worse fit at certain points, notwithstanding Reagan's self-image of being a, you know, he wrote in the diary, don't they understand they have the best friend in the White House they've ever had? So there are personality clashes, and clearly that has been the case in this administration. There are other parallels. In the book, one of the parallels I cite is actually between Bush 41 and the Obama administration, where there's a kind of public dissonance between the administration and the president and the prime minister, as there certainly was between George H.W. Bush and Yitzhak Shamir, and as there was even then over the settlements issue. And you've seen a kind of parallel here with President Obama. President Obama is, as I note, and as you say, you said in the introduction, he prides himself on his commitment to Israeli security, which is genuine. And what he's done, and the level of cooperation on security and on intelligence, really is above and beyond what we've seen before. In some ways, though, it's driven exactly by what Ken said. The realities in the region have created that. You know, it's not just that we're going through a period in the region that in truth is unprecedented. We've had individual crises in the region before. We haven't had this many crises at the same time. You know, I used to say back in 2011, well, if it was just Egypt, that would be enough. But we're looking at Syria, which is a humanitarian catastrophe. We're dealing with a struggle within Iraq. There is a proxy war in Yemen. There is what we see going on in Egypt. There is Libya. All these things taking place at the same time. And they reflect a reality that is unlikely to change in the near term. There's a struggle over identity and who's going to control and define it. And for the next 10 to 20 years, the Middle East may well look like this. But then there's Israel. And whatever Israel's problems are, Israel has a set of institutions, a rule of law, a separation of powers, regularly and unregularly scheduled elections where the loser accepts the outcome. And it means that whatever its difficulties, it's going to find a way to manage, and it's going to be fundamentally stable. And at a time when the region is not. And when the United States needs someone it can count on in the region. So yes, there are differences. There are, I think, some interesting signs that we should talk about, even within this country, in terms of what I think are some of the demographic changes, the political attitudes that are changing as well in some respect. But still fundamentally, you look at Israel and what Israel represents, and the United States is going to need someone it can rely upon in the Middle East, someone who it can count on in terms of its basic stability, and that will be Israel.
You mentioned briefly sort of some of the changes in the United States, and I wonder if I can just get both of you to comment on what you think is the significance or the lack thereof of things like the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, or whatever currents of anti-Israeli, pro-Palestinian sentiment that we saw, particularly, I think, in the Democratic primaries, and particularly amongst the, very enthusiastic supporters of Bernie Sanders, and then just the overall cultural and generational shifts that at least some people see happening, particularly within the American Jewish community. Do any of those things, do you see them potentially having a long-term impact on the future of the relationship? And does history offer us a guide in this regard?
They will if the U.S. government doesn't take a firm attitude or position on the particular issues. I don't know how many times Susan Rice said it when she was at the UN. She's also said it as National Security Council advisor. And so has Samantha Powers, that we're not going to allow Israel to be isolated at the United Nations. And I don't care how many speeches you read, it's the same phrases over and over again. Now, I assume they mean what they say. If the United States backs away and allows an issue to go through and something to be passed, then it becomes troublesome. So the United States still has to do a job at the UN in not allowing BDS or unilateralism by the Palestinians to come to the fore and become part of the political process. The Obama administration has been consistent with that, as have other administrations. And yet, they'll be more than happy to be angry with Israel about issues that matter, the disagreement over Iran, about weapons procurement and how much and how soon. Those things seem to be part of the norm in the relationship that has gone on for 25 to 50 years. Just look, for example, how many times the Israelis and the Americans have disagreed over the use of words, withdrawal, settlements, QME, dozens of times in dozens of situations, and the arguments continue, and they still come back, and you still have defense ministers and chief of staffs coming in and out of Washington on a once-a-month basis. It does matter what the United States does. It does matter what the United States says. It's really important. And I think Israel takes that as part of the relationship with the United States, but I don't think it takes it for granted.
Dennis, you want?
I think there's a couple of dimensions to this. One is the dimension I think that Ken was talking about. It is an issue. One of the reasons I think that we're going to have differences with Israel. That's a given. And the question is how we manage the differences with Israel. If we choose to sort of highlight the differences, it gives space and license to others who feel they have to be even more antagonistic, or they have to be tougher. So when the U.S. takes a certain kind of tough position on an issue, then Europeans feel, well, gee, given where the United States is, we have to be even stronger on that. So that can feed things like BDS, even if that's not the intent.
Correct.
It can have that consequence. I do think there are currents here, and you said it. I mean, I think a lot of the Sanders supporters within the Democratic Party, I think, do have grown up in an atmosphere where there's a narrative about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that has emerged. The Palestinians have been very good at making themselves a victim, which, by the way, doesn't mean that they're not a victim. They are a victim, but they have increasingly made being a victim a strategy. The problem with making being a victim a strategy is the one thing it guarantees is you'll always be a victim. But that narrative has taken hold, and you certainly see it, you definitely see it in Europe, where there's a kind of simple acceptance that this is the sum total and explanation of the conflict, that the Palestinians are a victim and somehow the Israelis are the victimizer. You see it on some of the campuses here. BDS on a number of campuses has acquired a kind of saliency. You see it increasingly with efforts to identify with others who feel oppressed, and so you'll see, for example, Justice for Palestine will go on campuses and they'll go to every other group that, and they'll say, look, you're oppressed, we're all part of this broader coalition. And there's a kind of, oftentimes, instinctive support for that without looking at what's the character of this conflict. Or, I took part in a debate almost 2 years ago for Brown, and it was actually with Noam Chomsky. And the premise of the debate, which was a kind of, I guess, the annual question, was, in this particular case for this debate, was, does American support for Israel prevent peace? And for a lot of people there, that was just taken as a kind of given. So what I did is I went through every peace proposal from 1937 to today and asked who was prepared to accept it and who rejected it. Now, by doing that, obviously, I demonstrated that in almost every case, the Israelis, or in the case before, during the time of the Yeshiv, it was either the Jewish community or the Israelis who actually accepted the proposals, and it was Arabs and then later the Palestinians who rejected every proposal. Now, I wasn't doing that to say, all right, that tells you the whole story of this conflict. But if you're going to try to suggest that somehow the Israelis are the reason there's no peace, well, the historical reality suggests it's exactly the opposite. And so part of what has to happen is we who actually are committed to trying to resolve the conflict need to tell a story about it. We who believe in a strong U.S.-Israeli relationship have to tell a story about it, but the Israelis too have to be able to present themselves in a way that also says, look, here's what we're doing to try to promote peace. And one of the things, and this gets back to an issue that Ken was raising, settlements have been an issue, it turns out it wasn't the Carter administration that identified them. It was actually the Ford administration that first identifies them a certain way. They've been around a long time. One of the things I would like to see the Israelis do is make their settlement policy consistent with the two-state outcome. When the Prime Minister of Israel says our position is 2 states for 2 peoples, then make your settlement policy consistent with that. That's a good way to, again, remove the one issue that creates a kind of vulnerability, that makes it easy for the Palestinians to present themselves as victims. And it makes it easy to deflect attention away from, well, what are they doing to promote 2 states? What are they doing that's consistent with a 2-state outcome? So the point is, there is something here that you can't wish away. There is something here that you can't just deny exists, but it also has to be put in a context.
Can I say something about the comment about Ben Rhodes? I've never met him, I just read the article. But the comment made by someone in the White House that they're not particularly pleased about the way Israel supporters behave in the general public is not new. You know, during the debate for the F-15 sales in 1978, Brzezinski trotted out a bunch of people trying to make the case that the F-15 sales were a defensive weapon. And a couple people who went out across the country and had to do so complained that that just wasn't the case, that it was anything but a defensive weapon.
This was F-15s to the Saudis.
F-15s, well, it was the Saudis, the Egyptians, and the Israelis. It was a trilateral agreement. And there was a little conversation that went on in the White House in which some members of the American Jewish community showed up, and some members of the Carter administration, and Mr. Brzezinski. And finally, a couple of Jewish leaders stood up and said, you know, this is not a defensive weapon. This is not a defensive weapon. And Brzezinski stood up, and he pointed his finger at whoever stood up and said, you have to decide, are you Jews or are you Americans? And Brzezinski was quite angry, not so much at someone disagreeing with him, but that someone was interfering in the process of making foreign affairs and foreign policy. And he did not particularly enjoy that. And Henry Kissinger didn't particularly enjoy it, that there were people who were making policy that favored immigration, Russian immigration, that might have an impact upon his ability to make foreign affairs. So I'm not surprised that Ben Rhodes said it. I'm not surprised that bureaucrats say it. No one likes a speed bump or an obstacle put in their way. And so it's natural. Maybe you're not supposed to say it in an interview. Maybe you're not supposed to say it that way. But it's the norm of behavior when someone gets in the way. You would love to throw a pass 100 yards down the field and not have a defensive back. That's not the case.
Can I just say, October 1, 1981, Ronald Reagan is giving a press conference, and this is during the time of the AWACS sale to the Saudis, and he says it is not the business of a foreign country to make American foreign policy.
Correct.
All right, that's a quote. Now, that's a statement that was made in public. And people don't remember Ronald Reagan being tough against the Israelis, because in fact, in the end, he was a transformative administration. But apropos of what you're saying, there have been differences over these kinds of issues. It is interesting, every time an American president decides a particular issue is really important from the standpoint of American national security, and the Israelis or the Jewish community has been on the other side, every single time the administration has succeeded. So it wasn't just F-15s, it wasn't just AWACS, it wasn't just the loan guarantees of the Bush administration, or it wasn't just Iranian sanctions and then the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. So we've seen this repeatedly over time. There can be differences. What is striking, one of the things I note in the book, every single time when we've had one of these fundamental differences, or what appears to be a fundamental difference, afterwards the relationship has actually improved. So again, it tells you something. It's very easy for everybody to look at the difference of the moment and say, oh my God, that's it. You know, the relationship will never be the same. And yet, every time in the aftermath of that, it improves. So you have to ask yourself the question, why is that the case? And it's not. There's some people who want to say, well, it's just politics. Well, it's not just politics. It's because there is something fundamental about having shared values and also shared interests, and where, in the end, Israel is the one country you can count on in the region.
Joe Sisko in 1969 said, our interest in the Middle East do not center on Israel alone. Our moral and practical commitment to Israel is by no means toward everything Israel wants or does. Let me say frankly, if our friendship with Israel is the only thing the United States is left with in the Middle East, that will be a catastrophic setback for American policy. That was 1969.
Yeah. And we haven't gotten out some of Secretary Baker's choices,
Oh, no.
phrases, but we won't go there. You referred to them. I do want to talk about something that has struck me because I felt very personally involved with this from the first time you brought me to Washington in the early 1980s, Dennis.
I'm so glad about that.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. At a time when there really was no U.S. Israel strategic relationship to really speak of. And when I look at that history of what the conversation in this town was like, both when you dealt in terms of the think tank community, the policymaking community, but also inside of the government, where you would run across the vast majority of people working on Middle East issues in the State Department, the Defense Department, the military, the intelligence community, who had almost no relationship to Israel in their entire careers. There was at that time a thing that almost nobody talks about anymore, the Arabists. Arabists dominated the debate in Washington about Middle East affairs and the relationship with Israel in particular. And people genuinely, the notion that Israel was in fact a strategic liability and somehow an albatross around America's neck as we tried to advance our interests in the Middle East was kind of the currency of the day. And it seems to me that the last 30 years, thanks in large part, I've got to say personally, that Dennis was one of the original people working to advance this during the Reagan administration, the idea of an Israel-U.S. strategic relationship. But now, I think you find amongst the military, the intelligence community, people at the Defense Department, in fact, some of the strongest defenders of this relationship, precisely because they know the region is so volatile, and they know that there's so much there that they can rely on in terms of times of stress and instability. That they, and whatever the political arguments are, that at that level, the relationships have just been completely transformed.
Let me say just one thing about that. In a sense, strategic cooperation began in the Reagan administration. The first 2 years of the Reagan administration were among maybe the lowest point of the U.S.-Israeli relationship from the time of Israel's founding. And it was because there were a series of surprises, and then it was because of the siege of Beirut. But Reagan comes back to his instincts, and also George Shultz becomes the Secretary of State. Even people think of Alexander Haig being the driver of strategic cooperation, but he was out. Shultz comes in. The combination of Shultz and Reagan in the aftermath of our embassy being blown up in April of 1983, and then the Marine barracks being blown up in October of 1983, they come back to what they think is fundamentally, well, who can we count on and who is a threat to us? Now, what emerges from that, in fact, is an architecture for cooperation militarily and intelligence-wise and even economically. And that builds a set of personal relationships. Institutions, after all, are made up of people. And over time, the reason, what you said, John, the reason it exists this way is because from that time on, service-to-service relationships have been developed. Intelligence community to intelligence community relationships have been developed. Individuals who are looking at particular threats or problems and they see who are their counterparts who can help them deal with that, they create a kind of nexus. And it lives from one administration to the next. You can have differences at the political level, and they can have some potential effect, but they don't shake what is this underpinning that has emerged over the last 30 years. That's another reason why, as we face threats from the region, and we're not going to be able to insulate ourselves. As I like to say, the Las Vegas rules don't apply to the Middle East. You know, what takes place there doesn't stay there. And so you're dealing with these threats, and so who is in a position to help you identify those threats? Who is in a position to help create a set of options to counter those threats? And it naturally creates this kind of logical array of cooperative relationships, and it's grown out of that.
Yeah.
Personalities really matter. They really matter who's president, who's prime minister, and who their immediate 3 or 4 people are, who are their advisors. It really matters a heck of a lot in this relationship.
Well, certainly it colors the atmospherics of the relationship for sure. And that's why, as I said, look, if I compare to the atmospherics of relationships of this administration, the one that sort of stands out, I think, is Bush 41. And yet, Bush 41 did an enormous amount for Israel, just as this administration has done an enormous amount for Israel. Sometimes the atmospherics tend to, drown out what are some of the practical realities that have shaped the realities of that relationship.
Let me turn to the peace process and the role that it has. I would say almost the outsized role it's played in the in the Israel-U.S. relationship. And I suppose since at least Kissinger's time, the issue has kind of waxed and waned depending on what else was going on. But I think I'm really more struck by just how this just won't go away. That virtually every single administration at some point in its tenure really feels the need to reach for the brass ring of trying to achieve some kind of breakthrough on the peace process. And I mean, I experienced it, in the last days of the Bush administration when Secretary Rice made such a big effort to do it, really made it her top priority at a time when Iraq was completely hanging in the balance, and really the only thing our Arab friends wanted to talk about at that point was Iran. Right. And yet the peace process became. In this administration, I was struck back in, and you'll remember this well, Dennis, because you write about it, in May 2011. Middle East is kind of coming apart. Dictators are falling right and left. The conservative monarchies are deathly afraid that they'll be next. The Iranian nuclear threat is still all out there. And the president goes in May of 2011, in the middle of all this, to give a speech at the State Department. It's actually billed as a speech about the Arab Spring, and it does deal with the Arab Spring to some extent. I think it's called something, the winds of change. Right. And then lo and behold, what are all the headlines the next day? They're about the president making new demands on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, that Israel needs to return to the 67 lines with some adjustments and whatnot. But it was really kind of striking, given everything else happening in the region kind of unraveling with no possible connection to the Palestinian issue. Right. And yet the president felt compelled to return to this issue at a time when nobody thought any real progress could be made, and did so in a way that actually caused a real degree of friction with the Israeli prime minister. And I think, there's been some of that as well, I think, with Secretary Kerry's initiative in 2013. The first thing he does, comes in, a new Secretary of State. Of course, Syria is melting down, chemical weapons are being used. ISIS is just about to emerge and break through in Iraq. And he spends the first year in office really devoted, traveling more than any other place between Jerusalem and Ramallah. Right. So it's all quite shocking, and it makes you wonder, why is this the case? What explains this? Can it be changed? Should it be changed?
So you covered a lot there, and I do want to cover, it was actually May 19th, 2011, and then he gives a speech 3 days later on May 22nd to the AIPAC conference, which reinforces what he says in the first speech. I mean, the key parameters he was referring to is 67 and mutually agreed swaps, and he explains what that means. But the interesting thing was, it was his I call it the Arab Awakening, it was his Arab Spring speech. And I want to come back to the larger question, but I just want to touch on this because I do write about it in the book, and obviously I lived it at the time. What's striking is that for about 4 months we had been talking about giving this speech. And we had a lot of discussions with the president, and in the final, before he finally makes the decision to do the speech, there's sort of two factors that come into play. Several of us make the case you need to give 2 speeches. You want to give a speech about the peace issue, that's fine, but if you introduce the peace issue into, you want me to speak up? You really want to hear me as well. So the point was, if you give a speech, even if it's a minor part, if you go back and read this speech, 90% of the speech is about what's going on in the region. The last 10% is on the peace issue. And there were several of us who said, look, it doesn't matter if you give If you give 3 sentences on the peace issue, that's going to be the headline from the speech, and not what you want to say about the quote Arab Spring. I advise all of you, go back and take a look at the speech, because you'll see actually it's a very strong speech on the Arab Spring. And we worked very hard on it. We discussed this for 3 to 4 months. And sure enough, the reason it's only one speech is because all of his domestic political advisors are saying, look, the country doesn't care about what's going on over there. It's only about the economy here. And so the argument is you can't give 2 speeches on this because you need to be focused on domestic issues. So it's one speech because basically the domestic side of the House prevails on the president that he can't give 2 speeches. And so it tends to, unfortunately, drown out what was actually a very good speech, I think, on how we are going to respond to the changes taking place in the Arab world. All right, so the second part of your question, really the essence of your question, so why is there this need to address this issue? Well, one of the things I say in the book is that there has been a premise. I say there's 3 assumptions that have been embedded in the national security bureaucracy for a long time. One is that if you cooperate with Israel, it will cost you with the Arabs, and I show through multiple administrations those that do it, that isn't the case. Another one is if you distance from Israel, you'll gain with the Arabs, and the same thing, it never happens. And third is that the only way you can change the American position in the region, and the region itself, is by solving the Palestinian problem. And as I note frequently, look, as someone who spent the last 30 years of his life trying to solve this problem, it may seem odd that I'm the one who's saying that, you know what, you really don't have to look at this issue as a game changer in the region. I believe you should try to deal with it for a lot of different reasons. Not because it's going to change the region. It's not going to change the region, but it's been embedded in the psychology of every administration from Truman on, that if you can solve this issue, it transforms the region. And you'll still hear people say that today. Even when, it's not going to stop one barrel bomb in Syria, it's not going to suddenly make ISIS disappear or make Iraq whole, it's not going to end the Yemen proxy war, it's not going to suddenly make all of the threats that Egypt's facing go away, or it's going to change Libya. It's not going to do any of those things. It is an intractable conflict. It would be great if you could demonstrate that an intractable conflict can be resolved. From the standpoint of someone who believes that Israel should remain a Jewish democratic state, you really do need to have a 2-state outcome, even if you can't produce that anytime soon. It's worth dealing with this issue, but for the right reasons, not because it's suddenly going to transform the region. But it's very hard to change that psychology. If you ask me, why does this have such an enduring effect? It is because there is this sense that somehow deal with this region and deal with this issue and it changes the region. Look, the most interesting thing about that would demonstrate why that's untrue, if this was the case, how come those in the region don't look at this as their main preoccupation? Go to the Gulf now. What are they preoccupied?
Sovereignty.
Not this issue.
Sovereignty, territorial integrity.
Well, what they're worried about is security and survival.
Okay.
That's the issue that dominates every other issue.
Yep.
If they thought this issue could affect their security and their survival, they would be addressing it. But they have other more immediate concerns. It doesn't mean that this issue doesn't strike a chord. It does. But it does mean that this built-in sense that this is the game changer, this has been a very difficult thing to basically remove from the psychology of almost every administration that has been there from Truman until today.
There are 2 points. One about dates and the other one about the Palestinian issue. Let me take the second one first. Anyone who takes a look at reading Arabic newspapers, as I try and do on a reasonably regular basis, and look at editorials, if you take a look at the last 3 or 4 months, what you find is Palestinians themselves criticizing themselves for not being able to step forward and have any say whatsoever in shaping their own destiny. They're angry at their own leaders. They're angry at the Arab world. They're angry at Israel's strategic advantage that it's been able to glean from Cyprus and Greece to Netanyahu going to Africa. I mean, there's a whole litany of writing that's gone on in the last 4 months, which is in complete disconnect with what people think sometimes inside the Beltway. I'm wondering sometimes if people actually are reading newspapers or they decided, well, let's not do it anymore. Let's read someone else's position paper. It's not because I live in Atlanta that I'm saying it either. And the second thing is Obama's choice of date for this 2011 presentation was rather unique, because if you look at Bill Quant's book, Camp David, Quant has a great first chapter, and he details the 4 years of a president. And he goes all the way through Bush 2. And essentially says, presidents do best when they talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict and they try and put forth their ideas during the first or second year of their term, never in the third and the fourth. It's just not done. But Obama did. I mean, Reagan was 82 and Carter was 77. They're generally done in the first year or the first 6 months of the administration, trying to get some momentum, something going forward. Which suggests to me, because he did it, and because he had to put that paragraph on, as Dennis suggested, or indicated, it indicated just how deeply motivated he was to try and make something happen, how it eats at him. And that adds to a third point. Presidents who are elected with one point of view easily during the 4 years will change that point of view before they leave. And just because someone is elected on this or that platform or this or that principle, once they get into office and they see what the reality is, they're much likely to change and shift, and sometimes in very dramatic fashion.
Can I just add, I know we're supposed to go to a Q&A. I just want to add one thing again on the timing, this particular timing of the May 19th speech. One of the reasons that the president feels that he has to give this speech is that he's about to go to the G20. On May 22nd, he gives the speech at APAC and he flies off to G20. Now, at the time, Sarkozy is determined to sort of present an initiative on the Middle East. And the president feels he has to give this speech before he flies out as a way of preempting what the French are going to do at the G20. So a lot of times you have a unique set of circumstances that will explain the timing of particular speeches. In this case, as I said, one speech instead of two, and because of the need to preempt and have us be the ones who are shaping approaches as opposed to at that point having the French do it.
We are going to go to Q&A, but I do want to get one future question in, and it does in part touch on the Obama. What do we expect in these next few months? This has been something he talked about almost on the first day in office, that he really wanted to try to achieve something on this. He's made several attempts, failed each time, seemed to have backed off, and yet this is a man who seems to want to get done unfinished business, whether it's Gitmo or a variety of other issues. Do you think something will happen, particularly because we do have, as you said, another French initiative kind of hanging around out there? So deal with that. Do you expect anything as briefly as you can? And then just going forward, both of you, a quick top lines of what that memo looks like to the next president when you're advising him what needs to happen in terms of putting the U.S. Israel relationship in a good place, and how do you talk about Iran in that mix? Dennis, want to start with you?
First, look, I don't think that the president has any great interest in wanting to launch any big new diplomatic initiative on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. His preoccupation between now and the end of the administration is going to, on national security and in the Middle East, is going to be ISIS. I do think that sometime in the interregnum, after the election and before the next administration comes in, he may well give a speech where he might choose to lay out parameters. I don't know that he's decided to do that, but I think one of the things he feels is that he doesn't think the Israelis or the Palestinians at this point are either willing or capable of doing anything. But I think he feels that if he could lay out a set of principles for how you could resolve the conflict, even if neither side can accept it, over time, the rest of the international community and the Israelis and Palestinians will come to realize these are the only parameters that will actually work, and it'll be a kind of legacy that he can leave, and it will have a certain benefit. So I do think that there's a potential for that. I think
Would you recommend that or no?
Well, if he gives a speech, presidents giving speeches at the end of the term, frankly, don't have a very big impact on anybody. I think the original idea was could you have that become a Security Council resolution with those parameters? I think if he were to give such a speech, it would be balanced in terms of the parameters, meaning, you know, he would address Israeli needs as well as Palestinian needs in the parameters. I don't think you can produce a Security Council resolution that can address both sides' needs. You can produce a Security Council resolution that will be specific on what the Palestinians feel they need, meaning it'll be precise when it comes to borders, it'll be precise when it comes to the capital, meaning 67 and agreed swaps. It would say 2 capitals for 2 states in Jerusalem. And then when it comes, that's what Palestinians want, then when it comes to refugees, it would say, well, there should be a resolution of the refugee issue. And when it comes to security, there should be security arrangements. So in this, you can get to the Security Council something very precise on what the Palestinians need and something completely vague on what the Israelis need. And that actually will make things worse. That will not make things better. I don't think the administration is going to make a big effort at the Security Council, because I think they realize that's the likely effect. In terms of your question on what should be, I think the key points to the next president on the U.S.-Israeli relationship would be on the substance. You will immediately address something that is important to the Israelis, but you'll also gain with almost all of our traditional Arab friends if you would make it very clear that you're going to focus very heavily on making sure that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is enforced. You're going to make it very clear that if there's any violations, you want to work out now understandings on what the price will be. You would like to create a joint implementation committee with the Israelis to watch very carefully what's going on with the agreement. You know, I think that Israel may have opposed this agreement, but now it has a greater stake than anybody else in making sure that it's actually fully implemented, so at least you buy the 15 years that you could buy, and you can take advantage of if you have bought 15 years, what do you do to take advantage of that? Make a suggestion on producing a set of contingency planning discussions on how to contend with Iranian threats in the region, and make it clear this is something you're prepared to do not only with the Israelis, but quietly with the Israelis and a number of the Arab states with whom the Israelis are working very closely. Immediately you send a message, you get the nature of the Iranian threat, which will be important not only to the Israelis, but also to, as I said, our traditional Arab friends as well. In addition to that, I would say, you know, today you don't actually have a back channel between the President and the Prime Minister. I don't remember the last time that has been the case. Reestablish that. I think there will be a strong impulse on Prime Minister Netanyahu's side to show if there were tensions in the relationship, it wasn't because of him, so he will want the relationship to get off on a good footing. I suspect the next president here will also want to show that things are also on a sound footing as well.
I wonder who that could be, that back channel. I can't think of anybody offhand. What are you doing the next few years? Ken, thoughts for the next president in particular?
Yeah, I think if Hillary becomes president, she'll be at least among the most experienced individuals who has taken the position since maybe Nixon or LBJ in terms of Washington experience. I would imagine she also knows the use of language. She'll be a lot more careful about what words she uses and terms she uses. I would suspect private communications is going to matter a lot, particularly in the U.S.-Israeli relationship, not being terribly public as some presidents have been. I think any president that's going to be elected knows that the Middle East is going to come bite them and is going to have to react to it, which means that you're going to have to appoint people who aren't loyalists but are actually smart people. So people who get you elected aren't necessarily the people who should be serving.
Okay, we're going to go to the audience. I think we've got a mic. If you can just identify yourself, and if you want to direct a question to either of the panelists, that would be great. Yes, right here. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Rachel Oswald, reporter with CQ Roll Call. Thank you for having this panel. Great talk. My question is for both panelists. Can you talk a little bit about your predictions over the next 4 to 8 years for Israel relations with the Democratic Party? mentioning that in late June, the Senate Appropriations Committee advanced their annual foreign aid bill, which included an amendment brought forth by Mark Kirk that would authorize local governments to disengage from entities that engage in BDS. The amendment was adopted, but a majority of Democrats, 9 Democrats on the committee, voted against that amendment that was supported by AIPAC. Tim Kaine is associated closely with J Street, and he did not attend Netanyahu's speech last March. And of course, Hillary Clinton, President Bill Clinton, is not known for having close ties with Netanyahu, and in the late 90s was seen to have been not so subtly campaigning for him not to be reelected. So with all of those notes in mind, what do you think will happen? And focusing this on BDS settlement issues and generally, not the broader security relationship.
Anybody?
Well, first I'd urge you to read my book because you might learn a little bit more about Bill Clinton if you did. So I think that I would be surprised if you didn't see more, if you wouldn't see a general support to deal with the BDS issue and to support, more general legislation to counter boycotts. I think there's, you have the governor of New York who was talking very loudly and proudly about what New York is doing with regard to that. And I think you'll find, I think this is a kind of bipartisan issue. I don't see it as a kind of partisan issue, and it shouldn't be. It should be a nonpartisan issue. And as I said, look, I think one of the most important things for Israel is to be sure that it remains a nonpartisan issue. Israel can't be a Republican or a Democratic issue. Israel needs to be a nonpartisan issue. And I suspect you'll see even more of an effort made on Israel's part to be reaching out more to Democrats, and I think also more to some of the communities that historically don't necessarily have any kind of real historical ties to Israel.
Let me say this about the BDS. I think the U.S. Congress will take a stand. I don't think it's something that will just go away. Second, Bill Clinton is not running for president. Hillary Clinton is. And I think it's a terribly important distinction that we make. And if one takes a look at Hillary Clinton's speeches, which she's given in the last 6 or 7 years, both as Secretary of State and afterwards, one sees a distinctly positive attitude toward the state of Israel and toward a two-state solution and toward Israel as a Jewish state, 2 states living alongside one another. And very apparent in her speeches, even when she was Secretary of State, on 2 or 3 different occasions she said the United States will not impose or the United States will not pressure Israel. And she said that. Now, granted, you can say that when you're outside of office and what you do inside of office are 2 different things. But I think it's most important for us to understand that if Hillary Clinton is elected, she's the President of the United States.
Yeah, Emory. Right here. No, up forward, and then that. Yeah.
I'm a former executive director of AIPAC, and I was struck by Dennis Ross's statement that every time there has been a crisis in U.S. Israel relations, afterwards relationship have gotten better. It's been about a year now since the JCPA, and do you think that since that time when Israel objected to it, in a very public way, with Bibi coming here and speaking to Congress, that there has been any improvement in the relationship?
Look, I don't think fundamentally the personal relations between the President and Prime Minister are not, I don't think they have changed, but John started off by saying, and I think it's true, we are very likely going to see a 10-year MOU concluded between the United States and Israel, and it will be significantly more than what was in the last 10-year MOU, And that follows the pattern. I mean, you look at after the F-15, granted you have Camp David and all that, but after the F-15 in the Carter administration, then you get the assistance to Israel gets institutionalized really for the first time of $3 billion a year. After the AWEX debate, which is a very tough one in '81, then you end up seeing the Joint Political Military Group established under Reagan and strategic cooperation done. If you look at Bush 41, after the differences on the loan guarantee issue, you still get the loan guarantee provided, and you'll look at what was done within that administration to ensure that diplomatic relations are established with countries that had never existed before on the one hand, and also what's done in terms of just the effort that is made to ensure that Soviet Jewry ends up going to Israel. So in every administration where we've seen these big fights, what we've seen in the aftermath is we've seen a change for the better, and I would say the MOU being concluded, which is going to be, as I said, it's going to have very significant resources, will also be another indicator of that. What I'm getting at is not that the personal relations always change, but the fundamentals of the relationship seem to become more rooted.
Yes, this gentleman right here.
Seems to be on. Good. I'm Dan Raviv with CBS. This is directed at Dennis, though hello, Ken. Dennis, by any chance have you minimized or understated the importance that an Israeli-Palestinian deal would have if it really were a great deal well implemented, with the U.S. and the EU and maybe Arab Gulf states contributing to an investment fund, etc.? What a big win it would be, and certainly could change the U.S. image in the area that we're involved in something positive. And secondly, with this unprecedented set of crises going on, in a bizarre way, maybe the Israeli-Palestinian deal would be the easiest thing to do. It's like a structure where everyone already knows the framework, and you just kind of have to screw in the last screw.
I wish, Dan, I wish it were just the last screw.
Yeah. I was going to start off.
That
by
didn't
saying
sound right, did it? No, it didn't.
I don't know that it's. Let me agree with it. Yes. Do I think it would have a lot of positive effects? Absolutely. Do I think it would make a lot of what's going on privately? Right today, one of the things we haven't talked about, below the radar screen, there's a level of Israeli cooperation with the Sunni Arab states that has never existed before. My colleague David Makovsky likes to refer to Israel as the first Jewish Sunni state. And it reflects that there's a strategic convergence of interest in terms of the threats and who can be seen as helping to counter those threats. So there is no doubt that if you had a peace, you could make all those, the private cooperation that is mostly only limited to security, you could take it and you could apply it to the water problems in the area. There's one country in the region that solves its water problems. It's Israel. What it could do for others that are going to face increasing problems because of climate change and drought and what's going on within the Middle East, which is likely to be an additional contributor to conflict, it would be a very positive thing. Would it change the American image in the region? It would help. Would it fundamentally transform it? There would be other reasons that we would see that there would be problems that would still exist. But would it improve it? For sure. Would it help the Israelis in Europe? Absolutely. It would have a lot of positive effects, for sure, including in the region, as I said. Would it make all the problems in the Middle East go away? No. And the question that John was asking me is, why has this issue had such an enduring hold for presidents who felt the need to make this a kind of priority? And the answer is because there was this embedded belief that this was the core of all the problems in the region. I mean, leaders have heard this over and over and over again. And so all I'm saying is it's not the core of the problems in the region, but it could make a major contribution. One of the things I said was, not just in the region, but even beyond, to take something that is seen as being completely intractable and show that it's not, could have a huge psychological benefit. But it's not going to suddenly make every problem in this region go away?
Yeah, let me come right here to this side on the front row.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Amanda Botfeld. I'm with the Israel Project. Thank you so much for speaking and FDD for hosting. So my question is, after John Kerry's negotiations, you had the Fatah-Hamas Unity Pact, which some people would say the negotiations backfired and actually produced a dangerous outcome. Looking from the future, if going forward in negotiations, is that something that concerns you, that just by having negotiations in general, we can create a worse situation?
You know, I don't know that, let me put it this way. When there's no process, the situation gets worse. When you have negotiations that fail, there tends to be a reaction to that. I think there's a lesson for diplomacy here. The lesson for diplomacy is don't reduce your choices to only two. Don't make your choices, if we can't solve everything, we're going to do nothing. That's a guarantee for doing nothing. And what we've seen in the Middle East generally is whenever there's a vacuum, the worst forces fill it. So the prescription, there should be diplomacy on this issue, but the diplomacy should be guided by a focus on what you can practically get done. And it's fine to have an ambitious set of objectives, but don't highlight the ambitious set of objectives and make that and create a set of expectations around them, because if you can't achieve them, then you actually do create a kind of situations that's worse. But don't let I'm worried that someone could interpret the premise of your question to me that, well, you know, negotiations, since they're not going to work out, they're going to make the situation worse. What has happened when there's nothing going on is a degree of hopelessness. Right now, what you have on each side is a complete loss of belief. Israelis and Palestinians today don't believe anything can happen. And that has contributed to making it harder to do anything on the one hand and making the situation far worse on the other.
Dennis, I think, used the word in another book called statecraft. It's what you do in between your negotiating processes, whatever that might be. And I think it's also terribly important for the next president to understand that just because the White House or the Oval Office gets involved in negotiations doesn't necessarily mean there's a conclusion at hand. You still need respective sides on both parties to have will and courage and have to exercise it and be willing to take chances and risks. And if you don't have that, it doesn't matter what happens in Washington. It really doesn't.
I've got to say, my own experience with this is not being a primary player or advocate of the peace process, but I think there is a tendency to believe that if you don't have either the Oval or the 7th floor of the State Department engaged in this, the process is hopeless and nobody takes it seriously anyway. And then when you do get those people engaged, I've got to say, it sucks up all of the oxygen in the room and makes it very difficult for anybody else working on really big strategic issues that might lend themselves more to the application of American power and diplomacy. Makes it difficult to get the time and resources and attention of the principles that you might need. Yeah, this gentleman right here. Yeah.
Hello, Gil Tamari, Channel 10 Israel. You know, with Israelis are interested more in the tachlis, in the bottom line. So for both of you, can we expect any peace initiative under two scenarios? One is with President Trump, the other is with President Clinton.
First, I have to be honest, I have no idea what a President Trump would do. So that's an answer. I just have no idea. I think if there were a President Clinton, I think that she would commit her administration to working on the issue. There's a big difference between working on the issue and suddenly raising expectation that peace is just around the corner. So this gets back to what I was saying. I think the key here is we have to address this issue. But the question is, how do you address this issue? And there's a range of activities between doing nothing and saying you're going to solve it. what needs to be done now, my own sense, and I'm not saying this is what the next administration, what a Clinton administration would do, but I'll give you my own sense of what needs to be done. We need to work at several different levels. The first thing is you've got to find a way to begin to restore belief. Can you change some realities on the ground so that both sides begin to feel that something can change and there's a sense of possibility again? Today, neither side believes there's any sense of possibility. So you start by what could you be doing to reestablish a sense of possibility? If both sides say they're committed to two states, maybe you work with each to have them take some steps that would demonstrate policies that would manifest a commitment to two states. You also, I think, have to bring the Arab states into this. Today the Palestinians are too weak, too divided, too positioning themselves for succession to Abu Mazen, to even think about, they view negotiations today as a concession. Forget what you have to do in negotiations. So on their own, it's very difficult to do anything, but they still need to be involved. So you need to see if there's a way to create some Arab involvement, some Arab state cover. But you need Arab state cover also for the Israelis. I don't need to tell you this. The Israeli public today looks and they say, what can we possibly get from the Palestinians? So if you're going to bring the Arab states in, the Arab states need to say, all right, what will the Israelis do vis-a-vis the Palestinians? What kind of concessions can they make? But then the Israeli public needs to know, and the Israeli leaders need to know, what will we get from the Arabs if we do that? So the Arabs can provide a kind of cover for Palestinians so that they can even negotiate, much less make adjustments or concessions. But they also rationalize for the Israelis, if they're going to make these moves towards the Palestinians, what they can get in return. Do the Arab states at this point have enough bandwidth to be involved in this, given all the other threats in the region? I don't know the answer to that, but I think, again, you don't probe that in a public way because you'll drive everybody into their most maximal positions in a way they can't do anything. You probe it in a private way.
Correct.
And you work to see, all right, what would it take to get you involved? What would you need to the Arab states? What would you need from the Israelis? And from the Arab states, you say, what would you be prepared to give to the Israelis? I mean, we need to sort of think at different levels what you do on the ground and what you can do to bring the Arab states into this. Now, that's not the stuff of launching a big public initiative. Doing something that makes it clear you're going to be involved is different than launching a big public initiative, but that's what I would suggest.
Small steps will get you the big one.
President Trump?
I have no clue. I mean, whatever it is, I can't say it in 140 characters anyway.
He said that he's heard this would be this is the greatest deal of all time. This would be difficult, he knows, but boy, it would be terrific to get it done. Would you tend to try and soften that instinct on?
Send them all to Atlantic City.
Yeah.
Look, what he said is that he would be neutral, because that's like you have to address. I don't know. He said you have to be neutral because that's how you have to be. Now, it is true that, look, there's a conventional wisdom out there that mediators have to be neutral. Like most conventional wisdoms, it's addressing something, but most conventional wisdoms are wrong. When the United States has been a mediator in almost any conflict, we have never been neutral in those conflicts. When we were active in Ireland, there was a perception that George Mitchell going in wasn't neutral because he had a historic relationship. With Holbrooke in Bosnia, he was seen as being close to the Muslims. The point is, when you're a mediator, by definition, you can't achieve an outcome if you don't address the needs of both sides. But the idea that we're going to be neutral, I gave a speech in Gaza in 2005, just before the Israelis withdrew, to several hundred Palestinians. And I said, look, I know, you don't like to hear this, but the United States is always going to have a special relationship with Israel. That's a fact. Now, that doesn't mean it has to come at your expense. In fact, when I gave this speech, it was just at the beginning of the second Bush term. I said, for the last 4 years, the United States hasn't been a mediator at all. Are you better off? At the time, Palestinians had lost about 4,000 people to the Second Intifada. I can tell you this group that I was speaking to, no one was shy in that group, and no one said they were better off when the U.S. wasn't involved at all. I said at the time, you know, we weren't involved at all, but nothing prevented the Europeans from playing this role or the Russians from playing this role, but they didn't play the role. And they couldn't play the role because they really didn't have the kind of relationship with Israel that made it possible. So having a special relationship with Israel is not inconsistent with producing peace. It may be a prerequisite for producing peace. In any case, it doesn't exclude the fact that you have to address the needs of both sides, not of only one side.
If you build this, statecraft requires quiet movement on the ground. And any success in Arab-Israeli negotiations always requires a measure of pre-negotiations, narrowing of differences, an agreement, a declaration of principles, or whatever the framework happens to be. You can't just run right into it, because that creates what 15 or 20 years ago was called confidence building measures or tension reducing initiatives, whatever it is. So things that are interlocked. So people see what they get, see what they're receiving. There's a certain degree of movement. And it also simmers down, calms down people's tensions. At some point, if you say we've reached a certain point, well, let's now move to another level. But that has to do with how you fine tune it as you move forward.
I just one more question. We're almost over time, but let's get it in and see if we can get some quick responses here.
Matt Wiesenthal from Congressman Hakeem Jeffries' office. I had a question for either of the speakers. Going back to the MOU and broadening the scope a little bit, I was wondering what your thoughts were regarding the level of aid America gives relative to the overall level of U.S. foreign aid. You know, some have said that, you know, given the flat level of overall foreign aid, Israel's increasing aid makes it have an outsized influence and reduces America's impact overseas, whereas I'm sure others a few years from now will say, you know, prospectively for the next MOU, we need to be increasing this further, or that the current one won't be enough. I was wondering what your thoughts were in that regard.
Dennis, do you want to?
Well, look, I would simply say there's a great irony here. It is true that, you know, we obviously provide a lot of assistance to Israel, and it takes up a significant share of the overall foreign assistance budget. But the irony is that it's precisely because that you know, there is support for Israel that it ends up helping to contribute to the overall foreign assistance budget. So those who help to press for this are helping to actually help produce a foreign assistance budget. And if you're really interested in trying to preempt the possibilities of conflict, it's a whole lot cheaper to be putting money into the right kind of developmental assistance than having to deal with the consequences of instability that end up producing conflicts. So I'm a supporter of foreign assistance, and I think actually the support for Israel has been a driver of the larger foreign assistance budget.
Great. Unfortunately, sorry, Ken. We are over time. This has been a terrific discussion, filled with a lot of depth and history. So if everybody would please join me thanking the panelists. And thanks to all of you, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.